wrote the Injil?
Well,
You can
originally,
take as much time as you want.
yeah, so the Injil is the teaching of Jesus, and from a historical perspective, that's literally the name of what he taught. And we know for about a century or so, according to modern scholarship, the early Christians had a more oral conception of Jesus' teaching. So Jesus' teachings were passed on orally. That's what Q basically is, right? And then at some later point, the Jesus tradition is sort of written down, and these Jesus sayings are sort of transmitted. In writing at some point, and then the anonymous gospel authors, they pick up these Jesus sayings and they have a narrative that they'd heard orally, and they put it in writing. So the Injil, from a historical perspective and even from a Quranic perspective, it is an oral revelation. It's not a physical book.
Some Muslims claim that the Gospel, according to the Quran's perspective, is not a written book, but merely the oral teachings of Jesus, oral revelation. They link this claim to the Q document, as if it were proof that Jesus' teachings were originally only oral before being written down. But is this really true? For the record, the Q document is not an oral tradition. Rather, it is a modern hypothesis in New Testament studies, suggesting that Q was a written source possibly used by Matthew and Luke when composing their Gospels. This means that if Muslims want to use this argument, they must acknowledge that Jesus' teachings were already being recorded from the beginning. So if they accept Q as a source for Matthew and Luke, why do they reject Jesus' clear teachings in the Gospel, such as his death and his eternal nature as the Son of God? This is a major contradiction in their argument. This Muslim is actually embarrassing his own Quran. The Quran itself refers to the Injil as something that the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, possessed. If the gospel were only oral, how could the people of the book judge by what was revealed in it? Even Muhammad himself was commanded to ask the people of the book if he had any doubts. If the gospel were only oral, why was Muhammad instructed to ask those who read a written book?
Guys, you see the circle of reasoning again? How do you know that Jesus preached the gospel and what it is? Oh, because of the gospels, which are corrupt and unreliable and anonymous. So you trust the gospels to tell you that Jesus preached the gospel, but when the gospels then tell you that Jesus also made statements, or they make statements about Jesus that show him out as a false prophet, oh, that's where it's corrupt. Moreover, how does he know about Q? Q is extrapolated from the material found in Matthew and Luke. So if Matthew and Luke are reliable enough to give you Q, then why are they unreliable in other areas where they show that Jesus proclaims his sacrificial death, his divine sonship? And moreover, there's a saying in Q, Matthew 11:27, Luke 10:22, where Jesus says, all things have been handed to me by my Father. No one knows who the Father is except the Son, and no one knows who the Son is except the Father, and to whom the Son reveals him. That saying from Q, which predates the Gospels, shows that Islam is false and Muhammad is a false prophet. Can't have your cake and eat it too, Andani.
For Khalil, why hold Q, the Quran, I suppose, is not affirming the New Testament? What if the Quran author was mistaken, thinking the New Testament was given to Jesus? Seems to assume divine authorship.
Yeah, so again, if the Islamic dilemma is an internal critique, which I said at the beginning that it is an internal critique and it's only presented to believing Muslims, then a Muslim can assume the Quran is from God, and they can simply say, okay, how does the Quran define the Injil? But frankly, even if we put that aside, you can do an academic investigation of how does the Quran define the Injil, and you don't end up with the New Testament. So I don't even have to assume divine authorship for what is the Quranic conception of the Injil, just like a lot of scholars ask, what is the Quranic concept of kitab? And Daniel Madigan, he applies a principle of charity. He's a Catholic priest. He says, look, if we want to know what kitab means in the Quran, we should read the Quran holistically. We shouldn't just assume the Quran is a disjointed, incoherent text. You only would conclude that a text is incoherent if all the possibilities of a coherent reading are impossible or completely nullified. But in the case of the Injil, we have a coherent notion of what the Injil is in the Quran, and it doesn't comport with any definition of the New Testament, which Sam still has to prove. It's been about 3 hours. I'm still waiting for the Quranic mention of the 27 books of the New Testament.
The Muslim said, the Quran has its own understanding of the Injil, and it does not match the definition of the New Testament. Christians must prove otherwise. This is a logical fallacy. If a Muslim claims that the Quran has a special definition of the Injil, then they are the ones who must prove it. 3 questions Muslims must answer. 1. Where in the Quran is there an explicit definition that the Injil is only oral revelation? 2. If the Injil was only oral, why were the people of the book commanded to judge based on the Injil? 3. If the Injil was only oral, why was Muhammad instructed to ask those who read the previous scripture? When they need an excuse to reject the New Testament, they claim the Injil was only the oral revelation of Jesus. But when the Quran itself says that the Injil was a book that was held and read, they ignore it. This is double standards. If we follow the Muslims' logic, it means the Quran is not only confusing Muslims, but also creating contradictions within Islam itself. This Muslim wants to define the Injil in a way that the Quran itself does not support. They claim that the Injil is something different from the New Testament, but the Quran does not support this claim. On the contrary, Quranic evidence actually points to the fact that the Injil in Muhammad's time was a written book used by the people of the book.
Doesn't comport with any definition of the New Testament, which Sam still has to prove. It's been about 3 hours. I'm still waiting for the Quranic mention of the 27 books of the New Testament.
And I'm still waiting for you to show me the Quran, where the Quran says how many surahs make up the Quran and how many verses make up each surah of the Quran. It's not in the Quran. Therefore, if you're going to follow that criteria, how do you know what the Quran is? The Quran doesn't tell you. Stop arguing from silence. That's a bad way of responding and refuting and proving your case. Moreover, I did more than that. I showed you the Quran says whatever revelation they had, that is the uncorrupt revelations of God. And they had the New Testament, whether you like it or not. Even you admit that the Quran is aware of the New Testament, interacts with it. Again, it's like you want to have your cake and eat it too. And finally, it's irrelevant what modern 21st century academic scholarship says. Unless you think the Quran is irrelevant, it wasn't meant for that time period. It was only meant for you scholars today. So if that's the case, the Quran was revealed in the wrong time period. Allah should have sent it down in the 21st century for you scholars. You have to answer what it means in its historical context. And I've given you context within the Quran and outside sources, and your case has been soundly refuted. There is a dilemma. The Quran confirms the Bible and yet denies its core doctrines, which means Muhammad's a false prophet. Come home to Jesus, and then he's waiting.
The claim that the original gospel was only oral and that today's gospel is fake is a very weak argument that contradicts both historical evidence and logical reasoning. Muslims often refer to the Quran to discredit the gospel, but ironically, the Quran itself never states that the gospel was merely oral. On the contrary, the Quran acknowledges the existence of the gospel as a written book. If the gospel was only oral, how could the people of the gospel be commanded to judge by it? Clearly, this refers to something written, not just an oral tradition. The claim that the gospel was purely oral contradicts historical and archaeological evidence. We have gospel manuscripts dating back to the 1st century, including P52, Ryland's Papyrus, a fragment of the Gospel of John dated around AD 125, just 30 years after John wrote his Gospel. Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, 4th century, proof that the Gospel was compiled long before Islam even existed. The reality is that all evidence proves that the Gospel was written from the beginning. If Muslims deny that the Quran recognizes a written Gospel, they must confront these Quranic verses. The Quran itself explicitly refers to the Gospel as a book, kitab, not merely an oral tradition, and we sent Jesus, the son of Mary, following in their footsteps, confirming the Torah before him. And we gave him the Gospel, in which was guidance and light, and confirming the Torah before him, and as guidance and admonition for the righteous. Key phrases proving the Gospel was written: Wa atainahu al-injil. We gave him the Gospel. Atayna means we gave in a physical form, not just orally. The gospel is described as something given to Jesus, not just memorized. If the gospel was only oral, how could the Quran say that Allah gave it to Jesus? Allah gives revelation in written form just as the Torah was given to Moses on stone tablets, Surah Al-A'raf 7:1-145. Those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whom they find written in the Torah and the gospel with them. Key phrase, maktuban, written. The Quran itself states that Muhammad was found written in the Torah and gospel. If the gospel was only oral, how could there be a written text mentioning Muhammad? This is a contradiction for Muslims who claim the gospel was only oral because the Quran itself claims the gospel was written.